Pella Nuroth Taylor on today's News Talk, The Pulse.
Welcome to the Pella Nuroth Taylor Show. Well, we've got we're going to spend the next 24 minutes talking about propaganda, but not propaganda that we've been hearing about a lot on my show, which is a propaganda aimed at the Russians from the British media, but propaganda in Syria, which was a sort of forced study of what we could expect, what we had later in Ukraine throughout the 2010s. Assad, the leader of Syria, was subjected to an incredible amount of propaganda. I mean, he was the Hitler of the 2010s, you know, and before that, of course, we've had the Hitler of Libya and the Hitler of the Balkans, and then the biggest Hitler of them all was Putin Hitler, and then the Assad Hitler faded away. But if those of you who have memories of what was going on 10 years back, the British intelligence agencies and their media were honing their skills in Syria. Now, a lot of what you heard about Syria from that mainstream media turned out to be false. And one of the most active and persuasive informers telling us what was really going on was Piers Robinson, who's an academic originally based in the UK. And he's going to tell us about the latest developments because, of course, there was a regime change a couple of months ago. And the issue of those chemical weapons, which caused Trump, who's back then in his first term, to fire off missiles, I think 2 years running, on basically a completely flawed case. Now, that case has been running for years. The OPCW, the International Chemicals Organization, infiltrated by MI6 agents and so on. It's a swamp of a story. But if you find out what really happened there, it will make us more skeptical and learn that how propaganda is all around us. And I think so. It's a good citizenly service that I'm doing here and Piers is doing for us. He's director of the Organization of Propaganda Studies, co-editor of Propaganda and Focuses, and was previously a chair professor in Politics Society and Political Journalism at the University of Sheffield. Welcome to show, Piers.
Very good to be with you.
So Syria, it's we know about. I'll just tell you my idiot's idea of what's the latest in Syria because I've got so much on my plate. But this guy called Jelani turns up. He looks like Zelensky's twin. I mean, with the same, as if they've been to the same propaganda school with his green fatigues and his Che Guevara beard. And then you hear about these massacres of the people that Assad protected. Anyway, you might be able to give us some background. But your story, you've been embroiled in this investigation, or you've been fighting for the truth. You've been, and before the show started, you said there've been some developments in that. So tell us what the developments are.
It's a long story, but I'll keep it short. But for sure, I as an academic was researching the propaganda war in Syria, and we started to look at the alleged chemical weapons attacks. And I started looking around 2018. Colleagues had been looking prior to that. Some had been looking at the chemical weapons allegations from the very start and raising questions about, is it really the case that the Syrian government is firing sarin and chlorine gas, etc., on its civilians? So I started to explore this issue in 2018, and then I got attacked pretty severely in the mainstream media for asking some pretty legitimate questions, and questions which, as it transpired by 2019, some of the inspectors from the Organization for Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, who were being sent to Syria in order to investigate these alleged attacks, they were asking questions as well about what was actually going on. And this led to the controversy, which has carried on now for a number of years, with whistleblowers, leaked documents, highlighting essentially the manipulation and the corruption of the investigation of the alleged attack in Douma in 2018. Essentially, just to reach a preordained conclusion. You mentioned MI6 there. The problem of the penetration of the OPCW fact-finding missions by operatives, entities from Western intelligence services and so on, and the way they effectively manipulated those investigations. And this is all sort of part of this bigger, you mentioned propaganda, the bigger propaganda narrative that was constructed around the Syrian government, that the Assad regime, in inverted commas, was using chemical weapons against his own people. This ultimately was used to legitimate and justify what was a 14-year-long and now successful regime change war, sponsoring extremist groups, Takfiri, Sunni extremist groups, in order to take on the Syrian government. And you mentioned Gilani, and it is now a successful regime change war. The propaganda has worked. The propaganda managed to dampen any real opposition to the dirty war that was being fought against the Syrian government. Made many people in the West believe that Assad really was gassing his own people when this wasn't actually the case. That is now a success for the West and its allies, and for its Gulf state allies, and for Israel as well. And they have Gilani in control. Gilani, who cut his teeth in Islamic Front in Iraq in the in post-Iraq invasion phase, who was involved in al-Nusra Front in Syria, who was wanted by the U.S. State Department for crimes against humanity.
Oh, God.
Until we got him into power finally. And that's where we are now. We have an extremist group in control of the country. As you mentioned, there have been extensive atrocities committed against, for example, the Alawite community. The country itself is essentially dismembered. You have Israel and Turkey controlling sections of the country. The US, I saw yesterday, are pulling out, apparently, allegedly, their troops from northeast Syria. But essentially, the country is broken now, and no obvious return to the stability that it did enjoy under the Assad government. And that's where we are. Where this will go now, and this was really this point about the chemical weapons, is that now, having maintained this argument that Assad has a secret program of chemical weapons and he's using them, the onus is on the OPCW and on the sponsor states of this propaganda operation, which is Britain, France, America, but also Qatar, and also Saudi Arabia, and also Israel. All of these players have been very much involved in the construction of the deceptive narrative over chemical weapons. And this is something I'm writing a series of articles about at the moment in UK column. But the onus is on all of these actors to hope, from their point of view, find something in Syria to justify this. So far, nothing has been found. The OPCW have gained access. The investigation team has set up offices and so on. My suspicion is that they're going to find, in inverted commas, something to try and justify. But they have their work cut out for them, because every indication we have is that it wasn't simply the case that the Syrian government was not using these chemical weapons against its population. These were false flag events, essentially. That there was no secret program either. No stocks. If you remember back to the invasion of Iraq in 2003,
right,
the mass destruction, there's very confident there's nothing there. They might try and plant something, but the pressure is on them to do that. I mean, in my mind, and talking to the people who I've been involved with researching this and so on, and people connected to OPCW, it's difficult to see what they're going to be able to conjure up. They might find a few documents, a few people that they sort of push, incentivize into saying certain things. But unless they find, stockpiles of chlorine gas cylinders and sarin weaponry in Syria, it's going to be a damp squib, and people are going to say, "Really, is this all that there is?" So we're in that phase, the same phase we were in post invasion of Iraq, as to is anything going to turn up? And of course, in the post-invasion Iraq phase, you had David Kelly, you had the US Ambassador Wilson, basically blowing the whistle that the intelligence had been manipulated. And then, it was like 4 years that they had those investigation teams going through, scouring Iraq, before they finally said, "Well, we didn't find anything," and so on. And then with all the controversies exploding, in Britain and America over the manipulation of intelligence, Dr. David Kelly, etc., all of that was going on, and so on. So we're in that phase with Syria now, and waiting to see what's going to happen.
Well, the difference is, the Iraq War, I was sub-editing at a Fleet Street newspaper, so it was very much part of that. I remember it very well. I think it was the last time when the British press really took a look at itself, and there was some examination into the deep state, and there was a kind of around 2005, 2006, everyone knew that the Iraq War had been fed even mainstream writers approach the subject. It was a well-known thing, and then bloody hell, 3 years later, 2009, 10, 11 or something, there was the Syria thing, and I thought this is within people's career memories. I mean, it's not. I mean, Syria, as you know, Iraq is now 20 years ago. A whole new generation has grown up, but back then it was only 3 years. And I thought, how can they get away with it? How can they get away with it?
It's amazing, isn't it? It's the memory, the short-term memory on display here, especially from professional journalists.
That's right.
But then, in another sense, it's not surprising, right? We know the constraints operating on mainstream media. It's documented in the political communication literature. It's the stuff I used to teach about when I was at university. Yeah. We know that they're not free in the way that they're supposed to be. So perhaps it's no surprise, but it does cause one to raise an eyebrow that there wasn't more skepticism. But as you say, they move on, and we move on now to Ukraine, right?
That's right. And then people, No. I mean, in a way, Syria is a bridge between the propaganda of Iraq and the propaganda against Syria. So I said to people, even though Syria. I want to ask you that in a minute. I mean, Syria might not be that important and obscure for a lot of people. It's important to know, just if nothing else, but for its propaganda purposes, because it did dominate the news cycle for a long time when there was nothing else going on. I mean, before the the Ukraine conflict became completely dominant. I remember Syria was the story, 2010 up to 2016 or something. I don't know. So, and it was lies all through. And I'm very glad you're telling it. Before we go into break, can you just say, why is Syria so important? I mean, why? I mean, there are lots of bad guys. I don't think Assad was a bad guy. I knew Syrians who said, well, we could go to the beach with our bikinis and we had stable lives and a national health service. And yeah, he did hang a few people, but, it was much better than the alternative, which is the Islamists waiting in the wings. Anyway, why, in their own self-interest, were the Brits and the Americans and the French going after Syria so much?
Well, it's important to place Syria in a wider context, which is Western regime change war policy using the 9/11 false flag in order to get that going. This is a major geostrategic belligerent campaign which was hatched in the 1990s. That the neocons were open about this. We have to shore up Western dominance before the Chinese take over, etc., etc. And they're going to use Western firepower and 9/11 to get to do that, to take out countries. Syria, Iraq, Libya, Lebanon. Iran is still on the target list. These are all countries which challenge Western power and footprint in the Middle East. And these countries had to be broken and removed. And that's where we are at now. We are sort of 24, almost quarter of a century on. There's 7 countries in 5 years, which Wesley Clark told us about. This was the plan. This is all coming to fruition. So this is geopolitics. This is about trying to get rid of enemy states as the geopolitical situation changes globally, as China and Russia, BRICS, India become significant players in the international system. We've been using all the muscle that we have at our disposal in order to try and protect our perceived interests. And this is why these countries were taken on in this way. This is, in a sense, this is World War III. It's just that we don't call it that.
Exactly. We're just going to go into a break. We're back after the break.
Get your favorite merchandise from our official The Pulse shop. You'll find exclusive online t-shirts, mugs, hats, hoodies, and more at thepulse.today.
Welcome back to the Peleneros Taylor Show. We've got Piers Robinson with us, who's a political scientist, co-director of the Organization for Propaganda Studies, co-editor of Propaganda in Focus, which is a great website if you're as interested as I am in propaganda in all its various forms. And it highlights some of the less well-known stories, which I'm going to certainly have a look at when I finish this interview. Piers, it's interesting you're saying that, this geopolitics, the Brits and the Americans have always supported Islamists. They supported in Afghanistan. Basically, they're the world island as America and Britain was an island in this Mackinder theory that, you've got to disrupt rival powers by sponsoring little terrorist groups or minorities sometimes, and just cause trouble. And we know that the Americans supported the Afghan Islamists, including Osama bin Laden, and they did exactly the same playbook. But because the Islamists have got such a bad reputation in the West is kind of been rewritten as Assad gassing his own people and our side of the good guys, And then, of course, the whole Syria conflict led into Ukraine. I mean, I don't know if you know about that, but Putin allowed Obama, was it, to take a step back, because he was going to attack. This story about gassing went back to 2014 when he was still in office, and then Putin said, "I'll talk to Assad." Assad, stepped down or whatever. And the Americans never forgave. The American neocons never forgave Putin for doing that and for saving Assad and saving Obama. So did they escalate? Did this whole Ukraine thing, to some extent, come out of the Syria conflict?
No, I think it's more that these are parallel processes. The struggle for control in the Middle East, with US, Europe, essentially NATO, Gulf state allies, and Israel on one side, Syria, Yemen, Iran on the other side. That is a power struggle that has been going on in parallel with the power struggle against Russia in relation to essentially NATO expansionism. This is a problem that's been there since the end of the Cold War, when we kind of promised to the Russians that we won't expand NATO eastwards, and yet we did. And so, the problem with Ukraine has been brewing since then. And this is part of, as much as the Western empires try to hold on to power in the Middle East or the Far East, Near East, etc. With Russia, the parallel track on this has been trying to control and suppress Russia's rise to its appropriate place in the international system. And, the eastward expansion of NATO, culminating ultimately in this proxy war in Ukraine, has about being, as much as we've been trying to break Syria and Iran, we've been trying to break Russia as well. So in a sense, it's part of the broader geopolitical process, but I don't think one flows from the other. These are parallel tracks. This is the Western Empire exerting as much influence and power as it possibly can in order to try and maintain its position of dominance in the international system. With Ukraine, it's now, we are where we are now with Ukraine. This is getting extremely serious and alarming with what we're hearing from the German political establishment and also from the British political establishment, who are openly talking about war with Russia in the next 3 years and telling their population to prepare. So that they really do seem to be, I'm taking them at their word. They might be exaggerating or spinning this, but I am taking them at their word at the moment, and this is extremely alarming. They might be crazy enough to drag us into a war with Russia.
I mean, what worries me is that the elites are so compromised, and one of the stories I've been hearing is that there are kind of sexual things going on. Like a guest I had on last week says he has papers showing that the intelligence services are fully connected to these sex trafficking that's going on, and all the potential for blackmail with political leaders, without going too much into detail about that. Anyway, and if the British and American and European elites are facing a sort of revelations of all their activities, like Iraq times 10 sort of thing, then they might escalate to war rather than be exposed and maybe end up with jail sentence, or at least their political reputations utterly ruined. That's what worries me, even if we're not prepared, even if we're not ready for a war, militarily.
Yeah, I think, in the sense of you have an oligarch in the West which is at risk of losing its wealth because of the impending financial crisis, which I'm told from people who study the economy, saying, well, it's going to collapse at some point, and so on in the coming months or years. You have the financial crisis. You got an incentive there for distraction and for maybe trying to mobilize populations along a war footing. You got that going on. You've got that sort of the realist kind of reading of international politics within the foreign policy community, which is that we've got to just hold on for dear life to our position in the international system, even if it means war. You have that going on. And then, as you say, you have this question of corruption in the West, the military-industrial complex. I always go back to Eisenhower. Eisenhower, when he was departing, he did warn everybody, right, that we're losing control of our democracies because of a military-industrial complex and the intelligence networks who are driving us down a path which isn't in the interests of the people. Kennedy realized that and then was assassinated very quickly, as we now know, by the CIA. amongst others, seems to be pretty clearly established now. So, you have all of this going on. This is almost like the end of the Roman Empire. This is the corruption, the vested interests, and then as you rightly say, the incentives there to just go to war as the house is collapsing around you becomes, very big, I think, for the elites that we have in control. We just need to try and stop them.
Well, that's what
before
we're
they
trying
get
to
us
do.
that
I mean, but we're small, and the mainstream media are big. What I mean, you're an expert on propaganda, and you're in Berlin at the moment. You follow the British and German media, presumably. Is Germany as bad as Britain when it comes to propaganda, war propaganda?
Yeah, terrible, terrible, terrible. Given the country's history,
Yeah,
etc.,
right.
it is quite, it's quite amazing how much the political classes just drink the Kool-Aid and
Don't
so
they
on.
see the irony, though? I mean,
Well,
if I said to
you
the
would
average person, who do you associate with the word propaganda? They're going to say Goebbels, right?
the average person on the street in Germany knows what's going on, particularly in the former East. I mean, this is why, for example, the AfD has such huge support, because a lot of the population know that the political establishment is corrupt and dragging the country into war, both on the left and right. So a lot of the people know it's the political establishment at the top, and they're as indoctrinated as the worst of those mainstream analysts you find in the UK. The Atlantic Council, the Times newspaper, the Guardian, etc. All of those people who are just firmly in that bubble, which is so detached from reality now, is unbelievable. But you kind of think, is that just going to burst at some point?
Yeah. Well,
So
you
on.
wonder about it. But then I don't know if you believe in the steal and elections theory. But I mean, but I just say, I mean, when the Reform Party, I talked to, I'm not so in touch with what the feeling on the ground is in Britain because I'm not there. But I talked to a guy who is. He says there's so much anger towards the political establishment in Britain, so much anger, and he said that no one. It's after the pandemic, and it says people that open people's eyes and they don't believe in war. If you see even the Telegraph, the old militarist newspaper, people are against. They say, "Come off it." Another piece of propaganda. Telegraph, you could do better. And even Telegraph readers are against war and are up to that. And then you have the Reform Party, which would win, 400 seats if there were a general election today. And then you have the AfD and all the left-wing parties in Germany. And it's the young people who are voting for these alternative parties. But apparently, it's that because the CDU and the establishment and the media controlling everything. And the channels, they still squeaked in, and you got that guy Merz, who's a kind of understudy for Hitler, sort of thing,
Yeah, he does look the part. But all of those things are true. But I guess what I'm getting at is that there is a lot of resistance on the ground. A lot of people have figured out what is going on. As you said, COVID-19 was a wake up for many, many people, and so on. We had a lot of protests in Germany during COVID-19. I think you'll see the same in relation to any drag towards war that we now see. People will be out on the streets pushing back. So, I think, we're not in a hopeless situation here. I think we're in a dangerous situation because our elites, it's a bad term really for these people, but anyway,
exactly,
the people who have power are so deluded, and they've painted themselves into a corner on Ukraine, etc. That I think it will take some cracks within the elite power structures. For example, people in the military, in NATO, and I used to go out to NATO Defense College and lecture. I know the senior officers said, most of them pretty level-headed guys and women, and so on. Them saying this is a crazy course to be dragging us down, and so on. We don't have the military capability to be doing this, it were. You'll see cracks emerging there, but then at the same time, enough of people in the population willing to go out on protests. They do matter. They count. There was a lot of pushback on COVID, and it did have an impact. And so if you have enough people out on the streets and enough people, wise people within the elite power structure, starting to raise an eyebrow and to doubt what's going in question, what's going on, that might be enough to start to shift us away from this insane talk of mobilizing for war by 2030, and we're going to take on the Russians. I mean, I tell you now that there is no appetite for that amongst the bulk of the population in Germany.
Well, I mean, Berlin 1945, need I say more, sort of thing, Anyway, thank you so much. Let's end on that sort of vaguely optimistic note. Don't get angry, organize, as some politicians said,
Exactly.
And this is part of it, I guess. Piers Robinson, thank you so much, sir. This is the Pell & Errol Taylor Show, back after the break.
Free speech is alive and well on today's News Talk, The Pulse.